You will hear of wars and rumours of wars. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. Devastatingly appropriate words for the tragic events of the last days. News arrived on Friday night of the terror attacks taking place in Paris, and it filtered throughout all of yesterday to the news that over 130 had died and hundreds more were injured. These were scandalous attacks of inhumanity. They are without justification. I was transfixed on Friday night with the French news. It's an astonishing world in which we live. I was listening to eyewitness reports minutes before emergency services had even arrived. I was watching social media as first-hand accounts outstripped any speed with which any of the news channels could cover the events. It was 20 dead, and then 40, and then 60. I got up at about 6:30 yesterday morning, partly because I wanted to know what was happening, and partly because I had an 8 a.m. meeting in Chelmsford before Diocesan Synod yesterday. And that was when I found out, as they were discussing on the news who might possibly have perpetrated these attacks, that was when I found out about the bombings in Beirut the day before, in which ISIS had claimed the deaths of over 40 people there. I wonder how many of us knew about the attacks in Beirut the day before they became linked with these attacks in Paris. I certainly didn't. I got to Chelmsford for 8 o'clock, and I met there the Reverend Kieran Bush, who was leading an event for Christians who were interested in sport. And that meeting went from 8 till about 9:30. And sometime between 9:30 and 10:30, he must have had a call from the hospital to tell him that his wife wasn't very well and that he needed to come in. At 10:30, Bishop Stephen announced to us in Synod that Kieran's wife, Ali, had died. She was about 30. They've got 2 kids under 5. And that was the moment when I started crying. Not over the 40-something dead in Beirut on Thursday. How could I? I hadn't even heard. Or over the 135 in Paris. That news I kind of drank in with that morbid excitement and fascination that you get from watching tragedy and terrible events unfold firsthand. But instead, for this one woman whose husband I've met maybe a half dozen times, it's most strange. 130 people die in terrorist attacks in Syria every 2 or 3 days. It's not that it's wrong that we're enraged and dismayed at the deaths in Paris, but as I said after the Charlie Hebdo attacks at the start of this year, it is a sin that we should place such different emphasis and value on Western and non-Western lives. Karuna Parikh, who is a writer and broadcaster, wrote a poem in the wake of the attacks in Paris that's been going viral on social media, and I share it with you now. She writes, "It is not Paris we should pray for, it is the world. A world in which Beirut, reeling from bombings 2 days before, is not covered in the press. A world in which a bomb goes off at a funeral in Baghdad and not one person's status update says #Baghdad. Because not one white person died in that fire. Pray for the world that blames a refugee crisis for a terrorist attack, that does not pause to differentiate between the attacker and the person running from the very same thing that you are. Pray for a world where people walking across countries for months, their only belongings upon their backs, are told that they have no place to go. Pray for Paris by all means, but pray more for the world that does not have a prayer, for those who no longer have a home to defend, for a world that is falling apart in all corners and not simply in the towers and cafes we find so familiar. What a world of misery it can sometimes feel like we live in. And what solace do we find in our scripture today? Today's the sort of day where you like to read the passage of how God cares for the lilies in the field and the birds, and how much more he cares for us, that he's numbered every one of the hairs on our head. Or how he's knit us together in our mother's womb and numbered all our days. Or how, even though we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, he leads us towards quiet waters. But instead we get given a couple of pieces of apocalyptic material. The end times, wars and rumours of wars, nation rising against nation and kingdom against kingdom. They feel out of place in the midst of our grief. They feel coarse and barbaric, like that well-intentioned but idiotic friend who says to you in the wake of tragedy, "Oh well, maybe it was for the best. Take a longer view on it." But that is the plea that they bring us, a plea for perspective. I want to share with you a story. On the 14th of February in 1990, Voyager 1 was just leaving our planetary neighbourhood, our solar system, and Carl Sagan, the physicist and astronomer, asked engineers to turn it around and take one last picture of its home planet. I've done my best to replicate more or less what that image looked like. It looked a bit like this. Sort of 3 lines of glare from the sun, and a tiny dot in the midst of the first line, just here, that was and is our home world. And Carl Sagan showed this image, and he spoke these words to it. He said, "Look again at that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you've ever heard of, every being who ever was, lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering. Thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines. Every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization. Every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer. Every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. The earth is a very small stage in a vast cosmic arena. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors, so that in glory and triumph they could become the momentary masters of a fraction of a dot. Think of the endless cruelties visited by the inhabitants of one corner of this pixel on the scarcely distinguishable inhabitants of some other corner. How frequent their misunderstandings, how eager they are to kill one another, how fervent their hatreds. the plea for perspective. The sort of thing that we experience often in our own lives when we get out of bed grumpily and make our way to the fridge and find nothing that we want for breakfast, and then we get a call from a friend detailing some personal tragedy that they're having, and suddenly our bothers seem rather less important. The kind of call to perspective that we have on a national level, where, fed up with our jobs, we turn on the news and find that in some town, half of all of the population who work at a single factory have suddenly found themselves laid off. The kind of call to perspective we have in our global lives, the kind of thing I experienced this summer when I was in Palestine, seeing the oppression and the hardship that those people live under every day. And I thought to myself, I have to endure this for a month, and they for the rest of their lives. But these scriptures invite us to take a cosmic perspective. It's a hard thing to do today, to take a cosmic perspective when the pain is so fresh. What Mark and Daniel make clear is that things going on in the heavenly realm are quite beyond our understanding or our imagining. These texts are a reminder to us that we will be delivered from evil, that we confess Jesus Christ, who is risen from the dead, who has conquered the grave, that we confess a God who has already fought the battle and has already won, whose work is complete, that we believe in the resurrection of the dead and life everlasting. And when does Jesus tell his disciples these things? Just before he goes to the cross. This is part of their preparation for the grief and the desolation that they're soon to experience. And so in our grief and our desolation, these are a reminder for us too. A reminder that beyond our understanding and our capability to do good or evil, Christ has already acted on our behalf. Now maybe there's too much pain to hear that today. Maybe the taste of bitter gall is too fresh in our mouths. But when you can, come to these texts and receive from them the cosmic perspective that they offer. That we have a firm assurance of a peaceful existence beyond the agony of today. Amen.